Hola, it's Joe Pardavila. This is the Forbes Books Podcast, and the trickiest part of being an entrepreneur is telling people about your product or service, or more importantly, how to get people to buy your product or service. Sure, there are tons of books at your disposal that might have a few good nuggets, and there are some great business podcasts out there, but I think the best way to learn more is from the people who've done it and taught it. My guest this week is Corey Poirier. He's a public speaker, podcast host, and author who has been called a modern-day Napoleon Hill. Corey, how you doing today?
I am doing super fantastic, Joe, and that's not just a comment, that I throw out there lightly. I try to live every day like it's my best day ever, so doing fantastic.
And now, is that the Canadian in you? Is that, do you think, or what do you think that is?
I think that was the years gone by salesperson in me. I used to go out in sales, and I'd notice every salesperson, when somebody'd say, "How are you doing?" they'd say, "Oh, I'm fine." And I said, that doesn't seem very enlightening. You're going in to do a cold call on somebody who doesn't want to see you, and the best you can give them is fine. And so I really just started reconditioning myself. And then it stuck, and the truth is it felt better, and I became a happier person overall, so I stayed with it.
That's fantastic. It's funny that you say that, because whenever someone, like if I go to a restaurant or someone will be like, "Hey, how you doing today?" I'll be like, "I'm awesome." Because you know what? I am awesome. And not that I'm an awesome person, but I feel awesome because, we're out and about, we're living our best life. And I think the more positivity that you could extend in this world, it's so funny. Like, Corey, I don't know, I'm sure you may have, but have you ever read The Secret? The book years ago. It was like an Oprah book thing, and it sold gazillions of copies. Basically, it was like the law of attraction. What you put out, you get back in return. And the funny thing is, the only takeaway I got from that book was because it's in all due respect to the author, it's a little cheesy. It's like, if you want a Corvette, like put a picture of a Corvette on your wall and you'll get a Corvette one day. It's like that kind of level stuff. But there's one part of the book where they say, the easiest thing to make someone feel good is when you say goodbye to them or you're departing, you say, "God bless and good luck," or just "God bless." And I've done that ever since. And it's so funny to see the reactions of people when you say "God bless." Like, some people will be like, "Oh, that's nice." And then others will be like, "Wow, that meant a lot. Thank you very much." So I think, it's one of those funny things. It's like, if we were all nicer to each other, it'd be such a better world. Don't you think, Corey?
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. I think that'd be a hard thing also as well, Joe, not to agree with. But yeah, I do feel that we do get back what we put out, and I feel like if everybody just tried to live what I might call, the right way, and I mean, we could argue what's right and wrong, but in terms of treating people right, treating people with respect, giving more than you expect to receive. If we lived by a lot of those tenets, I do think the world would be a better place. And I also think that people would be smiling a lot more often.
Absolutely. And it's funny, I finish every podcast with don't forget the golden rule, because I think as simple as the golden rule is, treat others as you want to be treated. Going back to my previous question, it's like, would make life so much easier if you treated everyone like they treated, like you wanted to be treated. I know it's super simple and something that you tell like your child, but the fact that as adults, if we did that, boy, it'd be easy to get around in this world.
Yeah, so I kind of went to one level further as a speaker years ago, especially when I was doing customer service talks. I created this thing, the Platinum Rule. And it wasn't, of course, to take away from the golden rule, but the idea that I had was not only do we want to treat people like we'd want to be treated, but I think it goes one step further. Now in the world we're in, people actually want to be treated in a personalized way. For example, if I speak really fast and you're kind of a methodical speaker, you would probably rather me adjust to you than adjust to how I'd want to be treated based on that. So I was like, maybe let's go even a next level and say, let's treat people as they want to be treated, like we'd want to be treated as we want to be treated.
That's great. Yeah, it's funny. And when I coach talent, when it comes to podcasting, sort of on a point to what you say, as human beings, it's very much part of the evolution of ape to man is the fact that we mirror people. And I always tell people, what you put out in an interview when you're speaking, that's usually what you're going to get back. So you talk about, like, if you speak fast and high energy, people will usually match that. It's funny how we're even though as evolved as we are, we're still like apes. Like, if you see two apes sitting around, hanging around in the zoo, they're usually copying each other. So I think sometimes, if you are a high energy person, that becomes very infectious to other people. And I think when it comes to communicating with people, the more energy that you can kind of like shoot out into the world, I think you get, and again, circling back to the start of this conversation, you get that back in return.
100%. Yeah, we're absolutely on the same page, Joe.
Well, that's awesome. Well, talk to me about this transition, because you talked about being a salesperson to then becoming like this sought-after keynote speaker and podcast host. How did that transition happen?
Wow. It actually started with sales, but it took a weird journey into stand-up comedy. And I know that sounds like, what? How do they connect? What happened was I was in sales for 10 years, in corporate sales, and had a lot of success, not early on, but ultimately had a lot of success overall. And like everything, I had to learn the hard way. But I got there, and then near the end of my sales career, I ended up getting tricked into performing stand-up comedy one night. So what happened was I went to a 2-week comedy workshop. Week number 3, we were going to learn how other people entertained us and then have a clinic and talk about what we learned. And so the idea was we were going to watch other comics. We booked the show. We brought all the people, and we were just going to sit there and watch. And the comic told us with about 5 minutes notice, hey, you guys are the comics tonight. 8 out of the 15 who paid for the workshop walked out the front door. I've never seen them again. No surprise, perhaps. 7, foolishly, me included, stayed. I got up and told the first 2 jokes because I had learned in my one Toastmasters meeting up until that point to go up first. So I jumped on the stage, told 2 jokes, bombed horribly, only to find out that I didn't have the mic turned on. That was my level at that point. He taught us how to adjust the mic stand, but not to turn it on. And so then we got everything set up again. I told the jokes again, and they bombed again. And so, Joe, I've said I think I'm maybe the only comic ever to bomb with the same material with the same audience twice in a row in 10 minutes. And yeah, so that's how I basically transitioned, because I got on the stage one night, performed, and I didn't die on the stage. So I came back the next week. And then I came back the next week, and I kept coming back, bombing, by the way, horribly for quite a while, not getting any laughs. You know, that's what we call in comedy bombing. And then what happened was somebody brought me to a Tony Robbins event and said, can you believe he's getting paid to do this? And I said, whoa, wait a minute, record scratch moment. People get paid to do this? And I'm going and paying like $20, in gas to drive to a comedy club in the middle of nowhere and get $10 from the door. I want more of that. And so what happened was, once I discovered there was a world called professional and public speaking, I approached the local community college, which was one of my clients, sold them on why I should teach a sales course with them. It took me a year to convince them. Finally, they put together what was the first sales course, I think, in the entire province of Canada that I was in. And I started teaching it as a business studies course. And that really evolved into me discovering this whole world of speaking. And then, of course, over the years, that kept evolving into new things. Like, that's what got me into interviews. That's what got me into podcasting. That's what got me into writing. That's what got me into TEDx talks. But it all started back from the stand-up comedy thing, which, again, maybe I was able to tackle even though I was terrified because of my sales background. So I feel like Steve Jobs says about joining up your dots. I feel like all those dots had to happen for me to get to where I'm at today.
That's pretty awesome. And so this journey to becoming sort of, I guess in industry parlance, it's speaking from the platform. And that is just as hard as breaking into the comedy world, because you have to grind. You have to start by speaking to rooms of 5 to 50, then 100. So it's like, it's growing. So what was that career path in terms of, because it is very similar. People don't realize that the world of comedy and sort of public speaking is very similar in terms of you have to start in the minor leagues and work your way up. So what was that journey like?
It's almost, so I'll say it this way. What made me want to quit is also what made me actually stick around. So in comedy. And so what I mean by that is, it's so hard when you're first starting to get a laugh. Like, it's like you're almost to the point where you'd pay people at the door coming in $5 to each one and say, please laugh when I tell this joke. It's almost to that point you're doing everything you can for that first laugh or that laugh in general. And I probably may have quit, but I read this interview with Jerry Seinfeld where he talked about how it took him 2 years to get 15 minutes of material that worked. And it occurred to me, one of the best comics in the world, one of the most successful, if it took him 2 years to get 15 minutes, then I shouldn't be complaining that it took me 2 years to get 5, because he obviously had more of an inclination than me. And then I had a friend, met this friend who was in comedy, and she ended up winning Star Search, the only female, I think, in history to win Star Search as a comedian. And she told me it took her 5 years to get her first headline spot. And so those are the things that sort of kept me going in comedy and kept me sticking around, even though I wasn't getting laughs early on. But you're right in the sense that I'll say it this way. I learned more about speaking in public and professional speaking from comedy than I did from speaking in public.
Yeah.
They're very similar, but being able to survive in a comedy club, it's a lot tougher than a corporate speaking gig, because in a comedy club, you have people that are drunk. You have the variable of this material is subjective. You have the variable of people might be offended by this. And I discovered it was so much easier to pull that back to do a corporate speaking gig than if I would have started with speaking to try to bring that to go to the comedy level would have been a harder, I think, transition. Like comedy was harder, so it was easier to go, okay, this doesn't work on a comedy club. Maybe it's not even dirty enough, but I can bring this to the corporate world. And I almost knew where the line was, where a lot of people don't in comedy. I almost knew where the line was from this will be okay and acceptable in the corporate world, and it's tamed down. And comedy helped me do that. So I learned so much about speaking from comedy, but I also learned it from bombing in comedy clubs for so long. And like I said, the only thing that helped me survive was to read the stories about other comics who I knew started out further than me, and it still took them a long time to actually knock it out of the park.
That's great. And it's coincidental, too, when I speak to folks about like becoming either better speakers or becoming better in broadcasting, podcasting, whatever, I say sign up for a long-form improv class, because they teach you the sort of the tools and tips about being a better listener, being better at listening and reacting, heightening stories. So it's funny that you learned a lot of those sort of mechanics from stand-up comedy. So I'm curious, what was your hook when you made the transition to a public speaker, keynote speaker? Like, what was your thing?
It's funny you asked that, because I had a lot of comics that I was sharing the bill with that really want to get into speaking, because obviously it paid much better. The hours were better. You're
people are less drunk. Yes.
People are less drunk.
Yeah.
You're speaking during the daytime. So if you're not a partier, then the hours are slightly better, and so on and so forth. And so a lot of comics wanted to make that transition and couldn't. And the reason I could, which ties into what my hook was that I had a very strong corporate and business background. So what I could do, for example, I mentioned I started out doing sales training. Then I evolved into customer experience. How do you create customer experiences? But what I had was a mixture of the business background and the entertainment background. And most of my fellow comics didn't have the business background, and most of my fellow business professionals would never get on a comedy stage. So I had the unique situation that I could actually go in with a business hook, even though I had been a stand-up comic, and basically merge the two. So I might talk about, as an example, one of my popular signature talks was around how do you get standing ovations from every customer? And what I did was I intersected the idea of how do you get a standing ovation as a musician or a comic, and how could you take that and then apply it to business?
And so what were a couple of key takeaways that people had from that talk?
One of them was the importance of delivering a wow, or the unexpected. When the Rolling Stones, let's say, starts a new concert, they have a new stage. I remember I didn't go to this one show, but a friend of mine did, and it's all he could talk about was how they had like the big lips and then a big tongue that just came out onto the stage, to represent the Rolling Stones. And that was the unexpected. You would never expect that to happen at a show like that. One thing for him that was an unexpected or wow was it was pouring raining, and they didn't stop the show. They just plowed on through, their amps getting soaked and everything. And whether or not that's even safe, I don't know. But the point is that they were delivering a wow by doing that. And so one of the things I talked about was delivering, again, the wow or the unexpected. And then I would take it to business and give a story like this time a person at a restaurant, when I asked for a Pepsi at the time, when I drank Pepsi, said, oh, we only have Coke product here. And I said, oh, no worries at all. Do you want a Coke? No, I don't drink Coke. And then about 20 minutes later, the guy shows up with a Pepsi on my table. And I said, I thought you didn't carry Pepsi. And he said, no, but the store across the street does.
Wow.
And there you go, right? The wow.
Yeah.
And so I would tie like how a band does it, and then carry it over into how we can do it. And then another example is being in the moment, so being present. And I might use the example of how would the audience feel in the 60s if we had cell phones, if John Lennon was getting texts from Yoko Ono and stopping to look at it in between "You Can't Buy Me Love." It wouldn't go over very well. And so much the same way, if you're working at a big box store and somebody walks in to buy a laptop, if you're thinking about your girlfriend or you're thinking about groceries that night and you're not really there in the minute with them, you're not going to be delivering a world-class customer experience. So those would be two examples that come to mind.
Great. I love that. Let's talk about the next step of your career, and that's when you became more of a broadcaster / interviewer, podcast interviewer. what was the impetus behind that? What was the fascination? Because at this point in your career, it was all about Corey Poirier. It was all about stand-up comedy and keynote speaker, being the man with the spotlight on him. Why did you feel the need to bring other people into the light?
This is kind of interesting because it actually was a pre and post situation. So the pre part is I had a business publication, which I always kind of compared to like a really tiny version of Success Magazine or Entrepreneur Magazine, where I would interview, at the time, it was small business owners. And what we did was we produced this monthly publication. Did that for a year. And that was my first business. So before I started the corporate stuff, before I got into comedy, all that stuff. And for that publication, I was interviewing people. And so I got a taste for it there. And interestingly, how it started again was it was more because I was forced to close that business when I was younger because I didn't have the capital to keep it going, and it didn't make sense to keep it going. So closed the doors in that business, but never felt right that I closed the doors. And so circle back years later, I'm speaking professionally. It's my full-time gig. And all of a sudden now, because I'm full-time, I can kind of do what I want. And I decided I never closed the door on that publication properly. Why don't I relaunch? And so I launched a similar publication, ended up running it for about 6 years monthly. And during that time, I started interviewing local business owners again. And it was more meant to be like a regional type publication. And at some point, I built this Dream 100 list of people that I would love to interview. Ultimately, I put the 100 list together, and then I realized, well, with my publication, even though it's small, people still love print. So it gave me a good approach. And so I started approaching some of these thought leaders, and I had some success getting these interviews. And then what happened was I started getting obsessed by what I was learning during the interview. So I became more like Napoleon Hill, where I almost couldn't stop doing it. And then finally what happened was I realized print really didn't have any room for growth. And so I also recognized that I was getting to hear the nuances during the interview from the people, but nobody else was. And audio would allow that to happen. So I ultimately realized because print was dying again, even in the small town publication world, and at the same time, I felt like people weren't getting to hear all the great nuances of the interviews. And I guess then the third component is that I was obsessed with doing it. I decided to move into the podcasting world and continue those interviews. And it just hasn't stopped. I guess the thing is nobody's told me at this point, stop doing it. So I just keep on doing it.
And is that basically your sort of main focus in terms of like the content you're producing in the Let's Do Influencing radio show?
Yeah, it is. And it's bigger than that as well. Like we have a member site, a monthly member site, and we do interviews, live interviews in there where then we bring them over to the podcast, those interviews over. We have our Blue Talks brand, which is totally separate, where I'm doing interviews regularly as well. Previous to the podcast, we had that publication I mentioned. We also did a book series called Conversations with Leaders, where I would interview roughly 100 leaders for a book, and we did 5 of those books. And so how I got into the thousands with interviews was actually from the newspaper, doing 80 to 100 interviews a month. And then that book series before I ever even got into podcasting. But since I got into podcasting, a lot of the interviews, let's say maybe, I'm going to say at least 50% of all my interviews are ones that air on that podcast, maybe a little better than that.
And you've interviewed, like you mentioned, you've interviewed thousands of people. I think over 6,000 is the latest count. And a lot of them are top leaders, high performers. What do you think from all of those conversations separates those people from the rest? You know, the old cheesy line, the best of the rest. You know, is there like a common thread, or are there maybe a couple common things that you pick up on during those conversations?
Yeah. So one of the great things about getting into thousands is you actually almost have like your own, what's the way to call it? Maybe a Nielsen rating. You know, the TV people are familiar with the old Nielsen rating of television, where they do a sample audience of X amount, like 1,000 people, and say, okay, this represents all of the country. Well, you know, when you get into the thousands, you can actually do that. You can actually say, okay, well, this many people all do this. They all have this in common. And so I've been able to really decipher what some of the common, I call them timeless secrets, because these are almost like Think and Grow Rich. These are things that'll still probably work 100 years from now. And so some of them, as an example, one is what I call the power of no. So what I've noticed, Joe, is that the thought leaders, the top thought leaders, say no up to 100 times more than the average person. And so what that means is people might come to them and say, hey, can you take this on? Can you help me with this? They're more apt to say no than yes, whereas most people are apt to say yes and then try to figure out how to do it.
Interesting. And why do you think that is?
I think truthfully, I feel it started with necessity. They just don't have the time. If they said yes to everything, they wouldn't be able to do everything they need to do. And so I think it just came down to even the ones that want to say yes and maybe are yes people and even want to please people by saying yes, just ultimately said, I'm just going to have a breakdown if I keep trying to put more into my plate. So I think where it originally started is some people just have that ability to say no. But I think where it really started was people realizing I just can't keep saying yes. There's no more room in my day or even if they have a team, my team's day to keep saying yes to everything. And they understood how important it was. So some of them, especially the ones that realized they are not good at saying no, they started actually employing people in their company who we call them maybe the gatekeepers, but they're the ones that actually say no for them. And sometimes it might not even reach them. Like the influencer might not even know the question was asked because the gatekeeper has really been hired and trained to figure out what a no and a yes is. Do they get it wrong sometimes? Probably. But considering the amount of times that they have to say no, even if they get it wrong once out of 100, it's still not feasible for them to start saying yes to everything. So I kind of say that they basically say no to all the things that won't move the needle for them so they can say yes to the few things that will.
And to you, let's flip it on your end. What to you makes a good interview or interview guest? Is there a moment in the podcast where it sort of organically happens and you sort of get that light bulb like, oh, this is going really well? Or is there something that happens regularly during a great conversation that you're like, yes, this is going to be a good one?
So one of the things that happens that I always say, I do like kind of what you said, yes. I'm just like the hockey player when you go to yes and you take your arm and you make it go up and down with your fist.
Of course, you being the Canadian would use hockey reference, but go ahead, yes, continue.
Yeah, and that's the one that popped into my head. But whatever the way a person says, yes, that's awesome. You might not say it out loud, and if you're on video, you probably don't do it emotionally. But I'll give you an example, is I had Mark Victor Hansen recently on, and Mark's the co-creator of Chicken Soup for the Soul series. And Mark said something to the effect of, Corey, I've never said this before, so I thought I'd share it here. I had Lisa Nichols on not a little while before that, and she said, you got stuff out of me that nobody has ever got out of me. I've never said publicly in my life before. So, Joe, when somebody says that, somebody who's like either of them who've done thousands of interviews, and they say, you've got me to say something I've never said before, that is one of those moments in my head where I go, okay, this is going well. That's a really good telltale.
Interesting. And so when you're doing these interviews, how do you feel like you get the most out of that person? Like what are some of the sort of life hacks that you've learned to sort of pull things? Because even though these people are either incredibly successful or high performers, some of them just don't like to share all that much, especially if it's personal information. How do you find the best way to get that information out of them?
To be honest, I think it seems small, but a big part of it is just the approach that you take to not being confrontational. I find that, and this isn't like, hey, my whole goal is to pretend I'm disarming. Like I find that I hear that a lot. People are like, I feel like I can share stuff with you I don't share with other people. And so I feel a part of that is because of, being this Atlantic Canadian, grew up in this small town, potato town, where, it's like, everybody is kind of like goes around and knows each other and all that kind of stuff. I feel like I get lucky. I got gifted by my grandfather, the gift of being a person that doesn't judge and that's very open and, we'll say, tell me more about that. But at the same time, not make it like, well, why would you do that? Confrontational type situation. So making it feel like at home. The second thing is I always tell the guests as soon as we start, it's going to be like a coffee style conversation. So they also know it's going to be conversational. So they're not going to have to worry about being too on guard and too polished. The other thing is when I started, I used to have certain questions that were prepared. Now I go with intuition. So whatever the last answer was, so I don't know until the end what the questions are going to be. And so I think that helps as well because they know it's not that I have this pre-planned agenda. And all these things are usually explained to the guest as well. So they know all this going in. I feel like some of those things help. And then another thing, because I have a good memory for stuff. So like, for example, if I bring Mark Victor Hansen on, I know enough about his story that I can ask stuff to him that maybe all interviewers wouldn't know that. And so that gets them thinking, okay, well, this guy's done his work, his research. And then finally, I think there's a comfort in community. So, if I have Mark on and I can talk, well, when we had Jack Canfield on, your old writing partner, he said this. I think there's a comfort for Mark that if Jack was willing to share with Corey, then maybe I can too. That was like maybe a 5, I guess. You asked for 1 probably, but that was maybe like a 5 point approach to what I'm trying to do organically.
Excellent. And so now that you have all this amazing content, you've built up this pretty prolific career of public speaking, podcasting, and even sales. How did you grow your audience? Because I get this question all the time. Like, I'm doing all this stuff, but I'm not getting enough listens, or I'm not getting enough clicks or shares. How did you find the best way to grow the Corey Poirier audience?
So I will say I thought it was going to be a build it and they will come type thing, and it certainly hasn't been that. And what I mean by that, Joe, is like I thought because I had been in sales for so long, then I got into speaking. I just thought it was going to be easy. And that's the only word I can use for it. And it has been anything but. And so building the audience there's been a few approaches. One, I've leveraged books to grow my email list, which sounds kind of unique way to do things. But early on, I was releasing digital books and giving them away for free, which helped me grow my email list. Another thing I did as far as books is in the front of all my books for the last quite a while, I have a sign up where it says, hey, thanks for grabbing my book, The Book of Why and How. If you want the free audiobook, go here. And so that's helped me because if you build an audience, let's say through email, then you have the potential through the emails you send out to build a relationship with that same audience. So that was one of the things I did. And then what I did though, because I understand that you can build an audience and relationship easier on social media, even though email obviously has a better open and conversion rate. But with social media, I find you can build a longer relationship and get to know them more. So what I would do on my email, after so often each time I email, I would send out an email and say, hey, I don't think we're connected on insert channel here, like LinkedIn. Would love to connect over there. And then so they would connect over there and we get to know each other more, but also it's good for marketing because if I'm putting something out through my email and then I put it out through LinkedIn, they're seeing it multiple times. So there's more of a comfort right there. And so that was one of the things I did. But then bigger than all of that, what I really did was I tried to give first. It sounds so simple, but delivering more value than you're expecting to receive is everything. And so by doing that, I built relationships with people. And then those people would want to share with other people what I had shared with them, or tell other people, you need to check this guy out, or connect me with them and say, oh, Corey just shared this with me today. Thanks so much for sharing that. But all of it came back to the idea of giving more value than I expected to receive. And as I say it out loud, I mean, that's one of the things that Napoleon Hill talks about in Think and Grow Rich, is always give more value than you expect to receive in return. And I think that's a way, and it's been a long, 20 years of doing that daily. I think that's another way I've sort of built a following. Now, having said that, Joe, nobody wants to hear that because that's not the sexy short way.
Of course.
So the sexy short way is the email way I told you. But what I've continued to do is put out content like books that I felt strongly about and believed in, put out podcasts consistently for 12 years that I believed in. And so keep putting that thing out I believed in, being consistent with it, but then also going out of my way to add value for the people that are in my network. And that could be like a Mark Victor Hansen or a Les Brown. It could mean me sharing an image quote of something they shared and then sharing a week later something I like from one of their books. And then it could be me saying, hey, Mark, so-and-so asked me about having certain guests on their podcasts. Am I able to connect you with them? And then giving value to him like that. But I'm also giving value to them that has the show. So connecting people and always trying to give more value. And then, like I say, the shorter cut is doing things like offering a free gift for people that decide to join my tribe, and then finding a way to go deeper in that relationship within the tribe as well.
I'd bet a Tim Hortons coffee that you also have read The Go-Giver at one point in your life, because it sounds like a big part of your messaging is the fact that give more than you receive. And I think in terms of when it comes to being in the sort of entertainment media space, it's basically the name of the game. It's always giving more than you get back. So I think that's a great way to think about it. So what do you plan on doing next, Corey? Because you've been on this sort of track for a couple of decades now. Is there more to the Corey Poirier story, or is it just all about continuing this message and continuing what you do best?
So, well, and to answer the question so it doesn't go unanswered, yes, Bob Burg. I've read The Go-Giver maybe twice. I've read a couple of his other books, like the series in the Go-Giver kind of franchise. And then we've had Bob on the show multiple times. I'm really big fan of his message. And I love that he practices what he preaches. For instance, if you want to test that, somebody listening right now, tweet Bob and take a quote from the book, Go-Giver, and tweet him. And I can almost guarantee you he's going to retweet that and he's going to thank you for it. And there's an example where you don't expect an influencer to go that far out of his way to thank you for what some might consider a small gesture, but Bob is doing that every day, and he's always promoting other people on his network. So I just want to back up that this is somebody who's living what he wrote about.
Yeah.
As far as me, there's definitely more chapters. I feel like I'm just getting started. And in fact, somebody said to me one day, well, is 50 kind of the end of the road when you're an influencer or what have you? And I don't even call myself an influencer, but just when you're out there creating content and doing stuff. Because years ago, growing up, people always said like 50s when you're over the hill. And, to me, I look at it and say, well, crap, Jack Canfield and Mark Victor Hansen created Chicken Soup at 49, I believe they were. Louise Hay started Hay House in her 60s. I haven't even reached that age yet. I mean, I'm just starting. And so for me, there's definitely more chapters to come. I'm currently working on 2 documentaries. One of them has been very active for about 4 years, and it's definitely been delayed by COVID. The second one was an idea that came from the first one, which will probably actually get finished maybe even quicker than the first one because it's a smaller project. So those 2 things are well into the works. Also, though, I have a brand called Blue Talks, which we just launched a little over a year ago. It's been 2 years since we've been building it, but a little over a year ago we launched it. And what Blue Talks is it's a book series, so an anthology book series, a podcast, virtual stage, and live stages. And so it'd be like if TEDx and Chicken Soup for the Soul got together and had a baby. We'd be the baby. So basically, Blue Talks stands for Business Life Universe. So it's BLU. And it's really a platform to help other people get their message out to the world. So now I get to create ripples for other people. So I get to help people speak on stages. I get to help people learn how to be a podcast guest. I get to help people become a best-selling author. And I feel like this was the next calling for me. Like, as you mentioned earlier, it was about Corey Poirier when I was doing the speaking and all that stuff. So I've said it's like, before I used to be the surfer on the wave, and now I'm the person trying to create the waves for a whole bunch of other surfers.
That's fantastic. And Corey, if folks want to get a hold of you, find out more about information, consume your media, where would the best place to go?
I'm a big believer on giving gifts, but also a gift of value. And so I feel like the easiest way to kind of get into my sort of my community is I mentioned earlier the book of Why and How. And so I'd love to give people the free audio version. So I try to go above and beyond, and I know more people seem to be diving into audio now. And of course, the audiobooks are often more expensive than the print books. So I'd love to give people the audiobook of that book. And it's easy to find. It's thebookofwhyaudio.com. Again, thebookofwhyaudio.com. And you can go get access immediately for free right now.
Awesome. Well, that's great. Well, Corey, I've really enjoyed this conversation. I can't wait to see, like you said, you still got a couple of decades left to make some more content. You got documentaries, more podcasts, more speaking left to do. So I wish you the best of luck with all that. Thank you very much for the time, Corey.
Thank you, Joe. It's been an absolute pleasure.
The pleasure's been all mine, Corey, and that's it for this episode of the Forbes Books Podcast. If you enjoy the show, make sure you take a second to subscribe so you automatically get my new shows when they drop. Also, if you have a minute, I would love if you left us a review so more amazing entrepreneurs like yourself can discover the show. And please, don't forget the golden rule and treat others as you want to be treated. Thanks for listening. Until next time, adios.
This has been a production of Forbes Books Radio. Find out more at ForbesBooksRadio.com.